Welcome to the wrap up for the Romantasy Rundown, where I'm going to be giving my final verdict on what I think romantasy is as a genre and how I feel about it, whether I enjoy it, as well as my thoughts on the Fairyloot Romantasy subscription in general. So if this is your first encounter with the Romantasy Rundown, I would recommend that you go ahead and check out the playlist in my description box, because I have just finished a 4-part vlog series where I read the first 12 months of the Fairyloot Romantasy subscription to help me to answer the question whether I enjoy romantasy, but also to figure out what romantasy is, whether there is a difference between romantasy, fantasy romance, and romantic fantasy, or whether it is just a buzzword or a marketing term or a gimmick created and utilized by publishers. So the reason why I use the Fairyloot subscription specifically to try and answer these questions is because I currently receive all of the Fairyloot monthly subscriptions, and in my opinion they are all already quite romantic in nature. I would say 80% of the books in the young adult subscription and the adult subscription have at least a moderate romantic presence within the plotline of their books. So that implied to me that for a book to qualify for their romantasy subscription, it had to be different to the typical, what I would class as fantasy romance that they used in their regular subscriptions. So part of this was kind of figuring out what that difference was to see if it helped me answer the question, what is romantasy, and is there a difference from the genres that I'm already familiar with? Winding it back a bit, if you don't know who Fairyloot are, they are a UK-based Bookish subscription box service. They have 3 monthly subscriptions, which is the young adult, the adult, and now the romantasy subscription, and I am currently a rep for all of them. They are also just about to launch a new quarterly epic fantasy subscription starting in May, which I am also a rep for. When I decided to carry out this project, I was not a rep for the romantasy box, so I paid for the first 2 or 3 boxes and I have received the rest for free as part of my rep term. I did disclose this in the first episode, and I'm doing it again here because I want to make it clear that I received these boxes in exchange for an unboxing and not in exchange for reviews. So my review of the books is not biased or influenced by the fact that I received these books for free. So during this vlog series, I read the first 12 months of their romantasy subscription. One of the reasons why I also chose the Fairyloot for this is because it is new. So all of the books that I have reviewed for this series are all of the books up to date that Fairyloot have released within this subscription. I also think that a 1 year, like a 12 months section of a subscription is a good enough range to give a verdict on the subscription, and also should provide like a decent range of books that that subscription has to offer. And these books in particular cover April 2024 up until March 2025. During the process of reading these books, I have been compiling them into 2 charts, one of which is measuring the star ratings, so how much I have enjoyed the books that I've read, and the second one is compiling their spice ratings, so how much explicit content, how much smut these books include. As a verdict of whether this sub was a success for me, whether it was one that I enjoyed, I was looking for a pass rate of about 40%. So that is 40% of the books being rated 4 stars or higher, because that is what I consider a book that I thoroughly enjoyed. A 3-star for me is a book that I did enjoy, but there were elements of it that didn't really work for me. So we were looking for 4 stars and above, and the reason why I chose 40% is because that is the same percentage of books that I rated 4 stars or higher throughout my entire 2024 of reading. I was also looking at ways that we can identify romantasy, fantasy romance, or romantic fantasy, and what I like or dislike about the genre as a whole. So throughout the entire process of this 4-part vlog series, I have been sharing my updates and sharing my progress as they happen, but today in this video I'm essentially going to be compiling all of my findings, all of the things I've learned over these last 4 vlogs, and bringing you my final verdict on what I think romantasy is and whether I enjoy it. And I feel like some of my findings are, unfortunately in some instances, expected, and I actually also learned some things that I didn't know about myself throughout this, which is great because that's pretty much what we were trying to achieve. So first up, we'll just do a really quick run through of all of the books that I read for this series in the order that I read them, which is the order that they were featured for the Fairyloot subscription. First up, we had Law of the Wilds by Annalise Brana, A Curse of Blood and Wolves by Melissa McTernan, Nectar of the Wicked by Ella Fields, The Rent in the Holly Library by K.A. Lind, Bonded by Thorns by Elizabeth Helen, The Half King by Melissa Landers, The Coven by Harper L. Wood, Woods, A Fire in the Sky by Sophie Jordan, Heavenly Bodies by Imani Eriyu, The Starlight Air by Emily Howard, Iron and Embers by Helen Shura, which is actually the first book in a spin-off series. So I actually read the first book in the original series instead of this one. We are going to be representing Blood and Steel and Iron and Embers kind of as one throughout this video, as they are just like both a stand-in for each other. And finally, Firebird by Juliet Cross. So as I mentioned, my pass rate for this video was 40%. So that is 40% of these 12 books rated 4 or 5 stars. And that translates roughly to 4 or 5 books, because I think it breaks down to like 4.8. And as you can see, we did manage to hit this because I had 5 books that I rated over 4 stars. Now, this is particularly interesting because I have done a video series like this in the past called Is the Goldsboro Science Fiction and Fantasy Fellowship Worth My Money? That series was not a genre exploration. It was more about me holding myself accountable to reading the books from the subscription so that they weren't constantly piling up. And actually, when I entered into that one, I did not think we were going to end up with the results that we did, because the percentage of books that I rated over 4 stars for the Goldsboro Science Fiction and Fantasy Fellowship was 27%. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is so that we have a little bit of a comparison between the two, because obviously rating 41% of the books from the Fairyloot Romantasy subscription over 4 stars is a dramatic increase from the 27% from the Goldsboro subscription. So in total, 2 of the books from this subscription I DNF'd, which actually for me is not very many, and I'm really sad that I don't have any actual statistics of the percentage of books that I DNF, but this has definitely made me want to keep track of that in the future so I can see the kind of difference in ratio between my typical reading and the reading for this subscription. 2 of the books I rated 2 stars, 3 were 3 stars, 4 were 4 stars, and 1 was a 5 star. So in comparison to the books that I read in 2024 as a whole, in 2024 I gave 20% of the books I read a 2-star rating, as opposed to the 16% for the Romantasy subscription, and 39% of the books that I read in 2024 were a 3-star, as opposed to 25% for the Romantasy subscription. So generally speaking, I know that this is a small pool of books. It's only 12 books as opposed to the 109 books that I read across the whole of 2024, but you can see that in terms of percentages, the percentage of books that I'm enjoying a higher percentage of books from this subscription than I am just my whole reading for an entire year, which I thought was really interesting. So that is actually much better than I anticipated. It's not that I expected to dislike this subscription, but I did think that there would be a higher percentage of DNFs for sure. And I also didn't expect, because I can be quite picky, and actually since I've done that Goldsboro series, I've only got more picky. It's like 2 years since I did that one. So I did expect there to be a higher number of lower ratings and much less books that I actually enjoyed. So this is a really good indication that maybe I do still enjoy the romantasy genre, which answers one of our core questions for this video. But also I thought it was really interesting to compare my enjoyment rating between 2 very different subscriptions that I have received. So while my enjoyment that I can assign a star rating to is obviously important, there are of course different levels of enjoyment. Like not every 3, 4, 5-star read is equal. And so something else that is an indicator of how much I enjoy things, I guess, is how many of these books am I going to keep. And if you guys don't know, I do have another series on my channel called Shelf It or Scrap It, where I read through some of the older books that are on my shelves, but also some of maybe the newer books that I've received. And with every book, I kind of give a verdict of whether I'm going to shelve it or whether I'm going to scrap it. So it's actually been really difficult for me to not give you that information throughout the course of this series, because I'm so used to that format. But there are quite a few of these that I'm going to be unhauling. Something I think that is worth mentioning though is that I am less attached to books than I used to be, unless there is a solid reason for me to keep them, unless I really enjoyed them or I'm definitely going to be continuing on with the series. I am more likely to just unhaul. And of the 12 books that I read, I am definitely, as of right now, going to be keeping 4 of them, which is The Coven. This one I may unhaul in the future, depending on how the sequel goes. It could go either way. Fire in the Sky, I really enjoyed this one. My favorite one from the subscription, as we all know, is Heavenly Bodies, and I'm definitely keeping this. It's also my favorite looking edition out of all of the ones that I read. And then while I didn't read this one, I read Blood and Steel. I enjoyed that enough to be pretty confident that I am eventually going to make my way to Iron and Embers, so I'm going to be keeping this one as well. There is one that I'm unsure about right now, which is Firebird by Juliet Cross. This one is the most recent one that I read, and I feel like I haven't had enough distance from it to fully make my mind up. There were elements of this one that I really enjoyed, and there were things like I didn't like that this one had such a romantic focus, which I knew that it would because it was fantasy romance, but I was definitely more interested in the politics and the fantasy and didn't care so much about the romance. And the fact that this one follows a different couple per book, even though it does form an overarching plot, makes me think that I won't really feel any different about the further books in this one, so I may unhaul this one. I'll probably keep it around for a couple of months until I finally make my decision though, and I do feel like this one is going to be an eventual unhaul. And then the rest of them, the remaining 7 books, I am going to be unhauling. 6 of these, so half of the books that I read for this subscription, are the ones that I either didn't like, DNF'd, or I enjoyed them but not enough to continue to invest myself in the series. And then one of them is a book that I actually really enjoyed, which was Bonded by Thorns by Elizabeth Helen. However, I don't love this edition. Like, it's nice, but I'm not obsessed with it. And I don't feel like this is a kind of series that I care about owning in hardback or continuing to pay like hardback special edition prices to get the rest of the series. So I will be unhauling this one, and if I do continue on with the series, I will either do so via ebook, or when they're released in paperback, I'll pick up the paperbacks instead. Another interesting question is, how many of these am I actually glad that I read? Like, how many do I feel I truly benefited from reading them? Because some books like you enjoy, you know, but if you never read them, you wouldn't really lose anything. And this is a particularly interesting one because honestly, the only one that I'm genuinely glad that I read, as in like, if I looked back on my life at all of the books that I read, this would be one that I wanted to make sure that I read, was Heavenly Bodies by Amani Eriyu. I enjoyed more of these. One that I really enjoyed was Blood and Steel, but I think if I hadn't read it, nothing would be missing from my life, whereas I really enjoyed this one, and it's one that I'm still thinking about like pretty frequently at this point. When I did the Goldsborough series, there was a much higher percentage of books that I felt like I was glad that I read. I'm pretty sure there was 5 of them, and I was trying to figure out what the difference was between those books and that series and that subscription, even though I enjoyed less of the books in that subscription and also this one. And I think the reason for that, actually one of the main reasons, is that the Goldsborough subscription skews a little bit more literary than obviously the Romantasy one does. So I feel like there's a lot more thought-provoking, impactful books within that subscription. And I'm not belittling Romantasy here at all by saying it's like a lesser genre than literary, but there are different books for different reasons. And while Romantasy and fantasy romance do deal with heavier topics and themes, and they can deal with them in incredibly sensitive and thought-provoking ways, but I think the main takeaway from me, like the thing that I'm looking for in fantasy romance, is that it's enjoyable. Like, a lot of Romantasy is designed to be enjoyable, but also that it impacts me emotionally, and it doesn't have to deal with anything heavy or like invoke a great deal of thought, whereas literary is actually more targeted towards doing just that. So I feel like in terms of impactful reads, there were more in the Goldsborough subscription than there were in the Romantasy. I was also asked a question by one of you guys which I thought was really interesting, and that was, how many of these books would I have skipped? During the Fairyloot subscription, like if you are a regular subscriber, I don't skip any books because I'm a rep, like I just receive all of them. But if you are a paying subscriber, you can skip 4 books per year. So before reading these books, the books that I would have skipped based on my personal preferences, having not read them, is A Curse of Blood and Wolves, Bonded by Thorns, The Starlight Heir, and Lore of the Wilds. And interestingly enough, after reading them, if there were 4 that I could go back and like never receive, it would be once again A Curse of Blood and Wolves, Lore of the Wilds, The Starlight Heir, and The Half King. So the only discrepancy here is that I would now decide to receive Bonded by Thorns, and I would instead skip The Half King. I expected to enjoy The Half King, but I really didn't like the writing style and I DNF'd it. And Bonded by Thorns contains one of my least favorite tropes. In fact, a trope that I actively avoid in Romantasy because it's never been done in a way where I enjoy it, which is the why choose or reverse harem trope. And I ended up actually really enjoying that book. So as you guys may have noticed, I did create a bunch of some new graphics for this video series with the help of the sponsor of today's video, which is Skillshare. Skillshare are an online learning community for creatives that provide thousands of on-demand classes that can help you level up your skills or learn a new one in both your professional and your personal life. Skillshare does cover a wide range of topics and disciplines as well, including art, photography, project management, content creation, and even self-care. So there's something there to really suit anyone. One of my favorite things about Skillshare is that they cater to both absolute beginners in a subject and also people who have a little bit of experience that either want to brush up and refresh themselves on those skills or to build upon them and take them to the next level. Over the last few years, I have been using Procreate on my iPad regularly. My main use for this is to design the foiled bookmarks that I send to the top tier of my Patreon, but also more recently, I have been using Procreate more and more to create graphics that you see in some of my videos, including the ones that you have seen throughout the Romantasy Rundown. And over the years, because of Skillshare, I have been able to level up from being a complete Procreate novice and also an inexperienced artist, because every few months I will go and I will take a Skillshare class and I will learn a little bit more and then implement those skills into my bookmark designs and into the graphics that I make for my channel. There is a vast library of Procreate classes on Skillshare. You can learn anything from shading, how to create seamless patterns, you can make a specific kind of design that will help you to learn new skills along the way. They also teach hand lettering, and a really cute class that has caught my eye recently is how to draw your dream home on Procreate by Kat Coquillette, which not only walks you through how to actually create the illustration, but also touches upon really important elements of art like color theory as well. So I'm looking forward to taking this class over the next couple of weeks, and then maybe I'll use my illustration as the base of a design for one of my future bookmarks. So if starting a new project or learning a new skill sounds like something that you guys would like to do, I am very happy to let you know that the first 500 people who click on the link right at the top of my description box will receive a free 1-month trial to Skillshare. Thank you once again to Skillshare for sponsoring this one. So because the Fairyloot subscriptions in general, like the young adult and the adult, are already quite romantic in nature, I anticipated that the Romantasy subscription in particular would have a level of explicit content that you don't tend to see in the young adult, obviously, but also the adult fantasy subscription. So I created the smutometer so that I could not only rate the books on their star ratings, but also for the first time ever on my channel, rate the books by the level of spice that each book contains. So ahead of time, I predicted that the books in this subscription would fall between a 3 or 4 chili pepper rating, with the normal Fairyloot books coming in at like a 0 to a 2. So I expected them to be a level up. So it went a little bit lower than I expected. Everything ranged from a 2 to a 4 chili pepper rating, but 2 of the books I did not rate. They were the ones that I DNF'd because I didn't finish them. I don't know how spicy they ended up being, but 2 of them I gave a 2 chili pepper rating to, 3 I gave a 3 chili pepper rating to, and 4 I gave a 4 chili pepper rating to, which actually is the same amount of books that I rated 2, 3, and 4 stars, which I think is interesting. My biggest takeaway from this project though is that my personal preference is books that are 2 to 3 on the chili pepper scale. I categorize 2 chili peppers as containing maybe foreplay, some moderate description but not too explicit, and maybe 1 like fully spicy scene, whereas 3 chili peppers is 1 to 2 descriptive scenes with some explicit language, and then going into 4 it's like more like multiple scenes throughout the book, maybe some kinks in there, maybe some dirty language, some inner monologues that are more sexual in nature, and just generally having more consistent explicit content throughout the book. Something that I also discovered through the course of this is that some smut is erotically written and some is romantically written, and my preference, I only had that realization halfway through, so I can't tell you what split of the books like falls into each category in that regard, unfortunately, but I did also realize that I prefer smut that is romantically written as opposed to erotically written as well. And it's something that really illustrates my preference in this regard is that my favorite books of the subscription were Heavenly Bodies by Amani Eriyu. This one was a 2 chili pepper rating, and I also really enjoyed Fire in the Sky by Sophie Jordan and Iron and Embers, or Blood and Steel by Helen Shorer, which were 3 chili peppers. And one of my other big takeaways from this series is that we were originally talking about romantasy versus fantasy romance because I personally believed that romantasy was just a term that was created, in quotation marks, because it wasn't, by marketing departments of the publishing industry to seem like it was something really new and exciting, and actually it is just like fantasy romance or romantic fantasy, just like rebranded so it looks new. I had heard some people say that they think that romantasy means that it is a romance first book, like it is a romantic book on a fantasy backdrop, and if you take the romance away there would be no reason to read the book, whereas fantasy romance or romantic fantasy is a book where if you took the romance away there would still be a fantasy plot there for you to enjoy. Something that I discovered or had a realization about halfway through this challenge is that there is a difference between being a fantasy first reader or a romance first reader. So I'm a fantasy reader first and a romance reader second, and different types of romantasy books are aimed towards those two different types of reader. So of these 12 books, I would say that 4 of them are for romance readers. And the interesting thing about this is that these 4 books coincide with the books that I gave a 4 chili pepper rating to. So all 4 of the spiciest books from this subscription, I would say are actually tailored more towards romance readers than they are fantasy readers. Whereas the remaining 6 books that I read, I haven't included the DNFs, I would say are more aimed towards fantasy readers. Now there is one question mark here, which is Firebird by Juliet Cross, because I do think that this one is a pretty equal balance of fantasy and romance. I think that it has a lot for fantasy readers, and I really love the fantasy setup that we had in here, but I do think that the romance overshadowed the fantasy, and so if you go into this like as a fantasy reader wanting a fantasy plot, you will ultimately be disappointed, though it does have a lot for fantasy readers in terms of like the setup of the plot before it gets a little bit more romance heavy, and that like takes over the fantasy a little bit. Something that I also kept track of here is whether the books were more romance or fantasy focused or an even split between the two. So of the 12, or should I say 10 books, the 10 books that I read, 2 of them have more romance than plot, but if I'm being honest, it's actually that they have more smut than plot. These were 2 of the spiciest books that I read. 4 of them were more plot focused, where there was definitely more plot in the story than there was romantic content, and I would say that 3 of them had a pretty equal split. So because I am a fantasy reader first and a romance reader second, my preference in this regard, definitely a minimum of an equal split depending on how good the romance is, because I have a very low tolerance, I've discovered, for reading romance if I'm not interested in it. And an example of this is how I felt about Firebird, because I was really interested in the fantasy, but because I wasn't shipping the romance and it was like an even split of the book, I was starting to get annoyed because we were spending time on a relationship that I didn't care about when I was more interested in the fantasy and the politics. So for me, it has to be an even split, but then for me to enjoy it, I have to actually care about the romance. Whereas if it's super plot heavy and it has a bit of a romance as well, then I can still enjoy it because the romance isn't the dominant part. And to be fair, even if I am enjoying the romance, preferably it would be more fantasy leaning for me or plot leaning for me anyway. Something else that I took note of was the tropes that each book included, and I'm very surprised. I'm not going to go through all of them because there's a bunch of like minor tropes throughout here that like only one book in the subscription had, but the 4 most common tropes across the subscription, the first one was shapeshifters, which actually is really unfortunate for me because it is a trope that I do not enjoy. I'm not a fan of shapeshifters, which I talked about in detail in episode 1 and also episode 4, I think, of the series. There is one book that I enjoyed actually, which was Fire in the Sky by Sophie Jordan, where it contains shapeshifters in a way that I actually enjoyed. And 4 of them had the fated mates trope, which I think is a very, very common one amongst fantasy romance. So I'm unsurprised that a third of these books contain that trope. I am very surprised though that only 3 of them, so 25%, contained fae. I expected fae to be higher on the list than the Shapeshifters. And 3 of them were retellings, with 2 of them being Beauty and the Beast retellings specifically. And interestingly enough, actually, both of those books also fell back to back. In terms of these settings, or like the fantasy subgenres that we encountered here as well, the overwhelming majority of them were high fantasy. So that is a fantasy book that is set in a fantasy world. 2 of them were paranormal, to the point where I would say that they are paranormal romance and not romantasy, which personally, as paranormal romance is such a well-established genre by itself, I don't really agree with it being put in the umbrella term of romantasy. Technically, it is a fantastical romance, so I understand why it could go in that category, but I think that does a disservice to the very well-established paranormal genre. And I do also think that paranormal and fantasy, while like I said, paranormal is fantastical, I do think they are different genres. And then there was also 1 urban fantasy in here and 1 historical fantasy. So this actually worked out very well for me because I am like a very typical like high fantasy and epic fantasy reader. So a high fantasy setting is my preference. I don't really like paranormal and I don't love urban. It works for me sometimes. So I am very glad that the very dominant setting and subgenre we had here was high fantasy. So this brings us to the very important question of what have I then learned about romantasy as a genre. Now, I did say that going into this, my opinion is that there is no difference between romantasy, fantasy romance, or romantic fantasy. However, I will say that romantic fantasy is something that I did not know that people were using as a term, but from my comments, because I asked you guys like, what is your perception of these genres? I had a bunch of people say that they thought that romantic fantasy, which I guess is a term that predates fantasy romance, is what I think fantasy romance is. So romantic fantasy is a fantasy book that has a strong romantic subplot. Fantasy romance, they thought, is what I think romantasy is, which is a book that is a romance book on a fantasy backdrop. And then a lot of people just didn't know what romantasy was, if we're going on that parameter. Or they thought that romantasy was a strong fantasy plot with a romantic subplot, and then fantasy romance was the opposite, a strong romance plot with a fantasy backdrop. So my opinion on romantasy specifically was that it is, as I mentioned, a buzzword, a marketing term, a keyword that is being utilized by publishers to sell a hell of a lot of books. And I do have to say that based on my experience of reading these books, and also based on like your guys' comments and your guys' opinions and the things that I'm seeing around me, this series has pretty much just reinforced my beliefs that romantasy is not a word that really indicates anything specific. Now, I did also say in that first episode that it feels kind of pedantic to me to use all of these terms that almost mean the same thing, and there are very few instances of 2 genres that actually mean the same thing. Now, Aaron from Booked and Busy did actually say that she'd thought of one, which is like literary fiction and contemporary fiction, which are 2 different genres that have a lot of crossover or are essentially the same thing. And I also thought of one, which is like paranormal fantasy and urban fantasy. I feel like they technically do mean different things, but they are also quite often used interchangeably. Like the Dresden Files by Jim Butcher, I would say are paranormal fantasy, and a lot of people say is urban fantasy. And what I have kind of learned throughout this is that we could use these terms and they could be really useful. So we could use, for example, romantasy to indicate a book that is targeted at romance readers and has a small fantasy element or a fantasy element that is not intricate enough to satisfy readers of epic fantasy. And we could use fantasy romance or romantic fantasy to indicate books that have a very strong dominant fantasy plot line and world building with a romantic subplot. And that would be great, actually. That would really help me, because then I wouldn't read romantasy. I would read fantasy romance. However, as long as the publishing industry are using it as an umbrella term that includes not only fantasy romance, but even in this case, we've seen paranormal romance. I mentioned in episode 1, I've recently seen them label Twilight as romantasy, which to me is very firmly paranormal romance, and kickstarted and propelled like the young adult paranormal craze in like the mid 2000s. It's actually not going to serve anyone. So I think for all intents and purposes, it is just a gimmick and a marketing term, because it's not being utilized in a way where it could be helpful. And as long as it is being used as this big umbrella term, it's never actually going to be used as a term that can actually really help anybody. In terms of the Fairyloot subscription, I had quite a few questions about the difference between the subscriptions, like what would I recommend and what is my overall thoughts. I think that the difference in the Romantasy subscription specifically, as opposed to the adult subscription, because I feel like those are the most comparable. Obviously, the young adult subscription is for young adults. The adult and the Romantasy subscription are both for adults. I think that the key difference between the Romantasy is the inclusion of the spicy content. So you're going to get a lot more explicit content in the Romantasy, ranging, as I mentioned, from a 2 to a 4 chili pepper, where I would say that the adult subscription tends to range from a 0 to a 2, with 0 being like no romantic content and 1 being like fade to black, like light stuff. In terms of my opinion on the subscription as a whole, I am very pleasantly surprised actually. I enjoyed a much higher percentage of the books than I expected to. At a minimum, I expected us to have more DNFs, and considering that my percentage of books that I enjoyed a lot is higher within this subscription than it is over one whole year of my reading, I would definitely consider that to be a success. And I think that for me, it is a subscription that is worth me having. You could argue like if you're not enjoying at least half of the books, it isn't worth continuing to have. But then if I'm not enjoying half of the books that I read anyway, then it's pretty much just in line with everything else that I'm reading. With that being said though, and obviously of course please do take into consideration that I am a rep for all of these, so I am not paying for any of the Fairyloot monthly boxes. Any extra special editions I get outside of the subscription are ones that I paid for with my money, but they're regularly monthly boxes I am receiving for free in exchange for my unboxings. While I do currently both have the adult and the Romantasy, and I am happy based on my findings from this series to continue to have the Romantasy, if I had to choose between the adult subscription and the Romantasy, so say for example I was paying for them both out of my own money, I couldn't afford to keep both, I could only keep one, then I think that I would choose the adult subscription over the Romantasy, even though we can't do a direct comparison in terms of enjoyment because I haven't read all of the last year of the adult Fairyloot. Maybe I should do that so that we can compare, but I have read some. I've read I think about a quarter or a third of like say the last 12 months of the Fairyloot subscription, and I have obviously received the adult subscription for longer than that as well. And the reason why I say that I would choose the adult over the Romantasy if I had to is because in terms of spicy content, my sweet spot, as we've discussed, is the 2 to 3 chili peppers, right? But if I had to then choose between 4 and 5 chili peppers or 0 to 1 chili peppers, I would choose 0 to 1. So I would rather read books with no spice than books that are very, very spicy. So I'm going to enjoy, in that regard, more books from the adult subscription than I am books from the Romantasy subscription. I do think there is a place in my life for 4 to 5 spicy books. Like sometimes I read Katie Robert books and I enjoy them very much, but if I could only read one, like if somebody said to me for the next year you can only read books with no spice or books that are like a 5 chili pepper rating, I would definitely be at the bottom end of the scale asking for no romance, please. And if you guys were to ask my advice on what I think you guys should do regarding the 2 subscriptions, if you guys can only pick one, then I would recommend that you guys do the same. Like if you need spice or you very much enjoy spice within your fantasy and that is your preference, then I would recommend that you go for the Romantasy subscription. But if you don't really care that much whether the content is spicy and you still want a bit of romance, then I would recommend that you go for the adult, because like I said, they're not explicitly fantasy romance or Romantasy, but the majority of their picks do include romance. Now, interestingly, actually, on this topic, somebody did ask me, are there any books from the other Fairyloot subscriptions, so the young adult, or I guess specifically the adult, that I think would be a good fit for a Romantasy box? And are there any books from the Romantasy that I think would be better placed in the adult subscription? They have done books in the past that I feel like would fit very well here of the Fairyloot books that I've read. However, they do predate the Romantasy box existing, so it wouldn't have been possible for them to be in the Romantasy instead instead either of the other boxes. But there are at least 4 books that I've read from the young adult and the adult Fairyloot subscriptions that I would consider to be firmly in the romantasy or fantasy romance category, irrelevant of their spice rating. And that wasn't something I was considering when I was reading these, so I can't tell you where I would place them on the spicy scale. The 2 young adult ones are Crimson Moth and Divine Rivals, which are both heavily romantic. They are in the young adult subscription, but I know that Crimson Moth for sure would comfortably be new adult. I can't remember Divine Rivals. I feel like that is very solidly a wartime romance that has a fantasy backdrop for the sake of making it more interesting. So this one is definitely the case of a fantasy book that is actually targeted at romance readers first, whereas the Crimson Moth I think is just a very solid like fantasy romance book and was one of my favorite books of last year. And then from the adult subscription we have The Undertaking of Heart and Mercy, which is one of the only instances of a romance book on a fun fantasy backdrop working for me, because this one is essentially a rom-com. It is a You've Got Mail retelling. She's in like a quirky fantasy world that doesn't quite make sense within the world building because the focus is on the romance. And then we also have Fate Inked in Blood by Danielle L. Jensen, which Danielle L. Jensen is a author that is typically known for fantasy romance, although I would say that A Fate Inked in Blood is not as like typical fantasy romance as her other series, the Bridge Kingdom series, is. That does not account for the spice in any of these books, in my opinion. You don't need the book to be 3, 4, 5 chili peppers for it to qualify as romantasy, but my observation from reading the romantasy subscription from Fairyloot is that the books in this sub are more spicy by far than the ones that they typically include. And then in terms of the other way around, are there any of these books that I feel would have been better placed in the adult box? I feel like Heavenly Bodies is firmly a fantasy romance book, but I do feel like it would have been quite comfortable within that adult subscription. And I haven't read Iron and Embers obviously because I read Blood and Steel instead. That is a little bit spicier. It's like a 3 chili pepper, but only just, it's like a 2.5 to a 3 than you would typically find in their subscription. But I do feel like if they really wanted to go along that route, and providing that this has the same level of spice as Blood and Steel, it wouldn't have been horrifically placed in the adult box either. But Heavenly Bodies for sure I feel could have been an adult book. In terms of things that I would maybe like to see from this subscription in the future, I don't want to see any more paranormal romance in here. I don't enjoy paranormal romance to start off with, so I feel like I'm a little bit biased there. But like I said, I don't think that paranormal romance is romantasy. And if I'm being honest, as this subscription has gone on, it has strayed away from that a little bit more. And also the spice levels have not dropped off a little bit, but I do think that 2 of the spiciest books in here are Nectar of the Wicked and A Curse of Blood and Wolves, and they were like books 2 and 3. Everything else has been like a little bit more fantasy and plot focused the more that the subscription goes on. So I'm wondering if there's any kind of like feedback there that people are enjoying those kinds of books more, or whether that was already pre-planned. But I would like to see the subscription kind of stay within the direction that it is headed in. And based on my preferences, I would like more fantasy focused books, more plot heavy books. I don't want books that are smut heavy because that isn't my preference. However, I do acknowledge, and I did say at the beginning of episode 1, that the subscription is not just for me, so I can't expect it to tailor just to my needs. And there are a lot of people out there who have entered romantasy and fantasy romance from being a contemporary romance reader that would prefer it to be the other way, where they enjoy books more like The Coven than they do slower books with slow burn romances like Heavenly Bodies. Answering the question finally, do I like romantasy? Yes and no. As we've discussed extensively, romantasy is pretty much just being used as an umbrella term that categorizes anything fantastical and romantic. So in that regard, do I like romantasy? Yes, I do. And I have been pleasantly surprised by the amount of these books that I liked. I did not expect to like as many as I have. And I feel like that is an indication, especially considering I only DNF 2 of them, that I do still really like this genre, and it is a genre that I want to continue to read and I really enjoy. However, if we were to use romantasy in its proper term, like to actually indicate a niche of fantastical romantic stories, and if we used romantasy to cover books that are more romance heavy or aimed at readers who are romance readers first as opposed to fantasy readers first, then I would not read romantasy. There would obviously be the odd exception of books that I enjoy, but I think I would definitely, well, I know that I would be tipping myself more towards fantasy romance as opposed to romantasy. But as it stands, as we can't reliably use the term romantasy to indicate anything other than a book that has both fantasy and romance in it, yes, I do still enjoy romantasy. It is really frustrating though, because the publishing industry and the way that they're using this term does make it a lot harder for me to discern what I like and what I don't like, which obviously works really well for them because I'm going to be taking chances on books and spending my money on books that I'm actually not going to enjoy because I can't figure out like how much romance and how much fantasy are in them. But what I would recommend that you guys do is find yourself some reviewers whose opinions you can trust, because throughout this I did say that there are reviewers out there who have enjoyed some of these books, which makes me think that I'm going to enjoy them, and that is because I know that their tastes in this genre are very similar to mine. So when it comes to Heavenly Bodies and when it comes to Blood and Steel, I hadn't heard or read a single review of those books. I didn't know any specifics or anyone's specific thoughts. I just knew the people I trust, like Stephanie Bookish had read Heavenly Bodies and Vish had also read Heavenly Bodies just before I read it, and they loved it. So I knew that I was going to, because my tastes in the genre are the same as theirs. And so what I feel like we really need to do in this instance, when you can't rely on marketing and the publishing industry, is find some reviewers whose opinions you trust, and you can kind of guarantee that if they're enjoying it, then it's something that you are likely to enjoy as well. So in terms of this series as a whole, I would say that it was moderately successful. I am disappointed that we kind of just reinforced my own beliefs regarding the romantasy genre, but I do think that we learned some important things about myself as a reader. The main three being that I knew this, but because I actually thought about it, I'm a fantasy reader first and a romance reader second. My personal preference in terms of spice, which is something we definitely discovered throughout this because it's not something I'd ever tried to track before, is 2 to 3 chili peppers, and I obviously prefer a plot focus in my romantasy. So that wraps up the Romantasy Rundown. I know a bunch of you guys have really enjoyed this series, and I want to thank you so much for tuning in to all of the episodes and also for giving your feedback. I do not have any concrete plans right now to do anything like this in the future, but I am very open to it. So if an idea comes along, then I'm definitely interested in pursuing it. I know a lot of you guys said that you would love to see me do this for another subscription, which I think could potentially be interesting, and it's not something that I'm taking off the board, considering especially I've done this for the Goldsboro subscription and I've now done it for the Fairyloot Romantasy. I know that a lot of you guys suggested you would like to see me do this with a different genre, which I think would definitely be interesting. I would just need to think a little bit about how exactly I would make that work, and a lot of you guys also expressed that you would be keen to see me continue to do this through romantasy, but using different selection processes to maybe narrow down what we enjoy, what we don't enjoy, and how you can figure out what books across this vast genre that have a lot of different elements to them you enjoy. But down in my comments, please let me know if you have read any of these books. Actually, let me know what your favorite book from the Fairyloot Romantasy subscription is, and also as a little bonus, leave a fantasy romance recommendation, like your favorite romantasy or fantasy romance book, down in the comments so that all of us fantasy romance lovers can find our new favorite book. And then of course, if you would like to let me know you were here but you don't feel like you have anything to say, leave me some sort of sky or celestial emoji for my favorite book of this series, which was Heavenly Bodies. Once again, a big thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and don't forget, if you click on the link right at the top of my description box, you will get yourself a 1-month trial to Skillshare. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. You head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, my Instagram, and my Patreon if you'd like to follow me on any of those. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.